introduction. Thank you to Natasha for hosting me. I heard about this topic on a podcast actually about 2.5 years ago, and it stuck with me so much, so hard, that I had to do all the research I could to figure out more about it. So the whole of the presentation is Practice Makes Parent. It is training for motherhood with 5 babies. Bobby Domicon was one of the hundreds of babies in the first half of the 20th century who were known as practice babies. From 1919 until 1969, dozens of colleges and universities across North America temporarily adopted babies to live at their schools in practice homes during the academic year. There, female students in the home economics department lived in these practice homes for several weeks, taking turns acting out different aspects of household management, including mothering their practice babies. During each semester, Bobby Domicon, whose surname was short for domestic economy, had numerous mothers at his home in Cornell. All were watched over by the director of the school's home economics department, who some may or may not recognize as the famed home economist Martha Van Rensselaer. Babies stayed at the school for only one school year, even less if they were adopted before the term ended. But Bobby Domicon stayed at Cornell for 2 years, from 1920 to 1922. He was admitted to the school as a malnourished infant, but left as a healthy child. After their stay in practice homes, the colleges returned the children to where they had been obtained, most often an orphanage. The babies were then adopted out to families without the knowledge of the school, as was the norm for closed adoptions at the time. So far, very few people have come forward as practice babies. The whereabouts of former practice babies are largely unknown. While few official records of these babies exist, they were written about in newspapers and magazines throughout their history. Based on newspapers from the Library of Congress Chronicling American Newspaper Database, in addition to a few current articles, I traced a narrative of public opinion from the beginnings through to modern reaction. Although to many today it seems to be an incomprehensible practice, the use of practice babies had its roots in then a modern and progressive understanding of both child welfare and women's place in society. What appears to be an at best ill-conceived and at worst exploitative notion to train women for a life of home-based childcare was actually part of a larger humanistic effort to create a better world based on optimistic faith in the scientific method and the principles of the progressive era. Practice babies made sense within their contemporary context and encouraged critique as to what defines a good family and what is the right way to raise a child. The practice baby movement originated with the field of home economics, which had its roots timed firmly to the progressive era. Through science and education, progressives believed they could make the world a better place. They regarded the home and the family as central to how society operates, so the logical place for progressive women reformers to start was in applying the scientific method to domestic life. They believed that through the application of the principles of science to everyday living, the environment would be controlled and consequently the quality of life improved. College courses in home economics strove to engender respect for their discipline, and to state definitively that traditional women's labor was real labor. If it was worth teaching, it was valuable. The progressive era's focus on science, democratization, and reform provided the perfect breeding ground for early women's rights activists to elevate the status of women. These professionalization efforts bracketed women's domestic activities as worthy of formal education, further justifying the existence of home economics as a discipline, while simultaneously promoting the idea that this work was challenging, difficult, scientific, and therefore important and worthwhile. Although not empowering in the way modern feminism might understand empowerment, by positing that women's domestic activities were worthy of formal education, they were also saying that women were valuable contributors to society through these labors and through their expertise. In a time when only 5% of the public reached high school, these degree pathways were practicable methods to further more women into higher quality education. The progressive era's focus on scientific application and efficiency naturally affected views on home life and parenting. The home economics field was developing standards for best practices for domestic life, including child rearing. These new principles propelled the idea that mothers needed to be trained. They needed formal education in mothercraft, and practice babies were the cutting-edge modern method. A 1924 Health Wanted ad illustrated the popularity of these ideas, displaying a desire for practicing childcare from the point of view of future mothers. A woman with 2 young adult daughters living at home placed an ad in search of a housekeeper who had a baby. The prospective chambermaid was to bring the baby with her, and while working, the 2 daughters would care for the baby. Their mother explained to her daughters have no knowledge whatever of little children or how to care for them, and are especially ignorant of the fact that a very young baby can be trained in habits and character. She wanted her daughters to practice mothering a baby before they had children of their own. This desire bred a sense of insecurity about one's natural ability to parent, and followed the contemporary thought that was put forward by the founders of home economics, that proper parenting was a skill mothers must be educated in. In the early years of practice babies, they were rarely criticized, and in fact were lauded. News coverage of these children generally remarked at how well they were cared for, writing stories only for the novelty of the situation rather than the scandal. As the East Oregonian put it, at 9 months old, the nation's youngest college professor was a baby in residence at Oregon Agricultural College, and the 5th one to hold that position. After remarking on his good fortune at being surrounded by pretty girls, the paper only stated that he will or should be an interesting character some years hence. Far from denouncing her use as a practice baby, the South Bend News-Times described baby Catherine Marie as the most carefully looked after baby in the world. This article even quoted, without opposition, Nebraska State University Chancellor Samuel Avery declaring that this practical training in motherhood is making for better babies and lower baby death rates. This was a glowing review. Out of 9 newspaper articles I found mentioning practice babies written in the first half of the 20th century, only 1 showed any reservation at all to the practice. Even this article did not mention any damage being done to the child, only that many offers of adoption are being received from women who desire to save the girl from being practiced upon by the co-eds. Every other article reported the children having plenty of love and care, with the New York Herald even describing Oregon Agricultural College's baby Alice Liu as having bloomed like a wee rose under the supervision of the practice mothers. Not until later did this practice become controversial, thus illustrated by the case of David North. At Eastern Illinois University, then Eastern Illinois State College, the Home Economics Department named the practice baby of the 1953-1954 school year David North. He was the second baby the school hosted. Their first baby had been adopted by one of its practice mothers after the previous school year. David had been loaned to the school for the year by his Chicago mother in a private agreement with the director of the college's Home Economics Department, Dr. Ruth Schmalhausen. In January of 1954, a local paper wrote a story about David, which then gained national publicity. Roman L. Hransky, superintendent of Illinois Child Welfare Services, publicly criticized the use of a practice baby when he stated that the primary interest of Dr. Schmalhausen was in teaching the girls, and her secondary interest was the baby. Dr. Schmalhausen refuted this claim. But the story had already become a nationwide controversy, with popular magazines like Newsweek, Look, and Pageant all writing about David North and all heavily critical of potential psychological damage. Time magazine ran an article about David with a picture of him subtitled, "David North and Mother, Heaven Knows How Many Neuroses." Hransky ordered an investigation into the practice house after much public outcry. After several months, and after media coverage had died down, the state's investigation determined that David North could stay at the school, where he had remained all year. Dr. Schmalhausen and David North's mother had made this arrangement all on their own, and it was therefore outside the jurisdiction of the Illinois Child Welfare Services. The college returned David to his biological mother just a few weeks after the investigation was completed. Despite public outcry and state investigation, Eastern went on to temporarily adopt another baby that autumn. Amy North was the youngest resident at Eastern Illinois State College during the 1954 school year. At this point, popular understanding of child psychology and child care had undergone a definite transformation from the early years of the Practice Baby program. The highly structured, scientific method of parenting gave way to a more relaxed, Spockian attitude. Practice Baby programs were on their way out by the mid-20th century. NPR said that the last Practice Baby program ended in 1969. The same year, Cornell closed its practice houses. Practice babies did not vanish because they were part of an inherently bad practice which was shut down once unearthed. The investigation at Eastern Illinois State College shows that they did not commit any crimes and the welfare of the child was not in jeopardy. They were not a secret either, with myriad news and magazine articles mentioning them. For decades, practice babies in practice homes were a valuable part of the home economics education. They went away because a larger cultural shift took place which valued an individualized, child-centric model of parenting over a regimented, one-size-fits-all approach. Practice babies went away because they were no longer thought of as the best way to learn parenting, not because there was a big expose which rocked the world of higher education and forced the closing of all the practice homes. They simply gradually disappeared as values changed. This shift was coupled with another that is perhaps more of the reason that practice babies seem so antiquated and foreign to us today. In the Progressive era, home economics was a more socially acceptable route for a woman to receive an education. It was a movement founded by some of the most educated progressive women of the day. The field was an intentional movement to elevate the work of women. During the second half of the 20th century, though, this became outdated. More women were entering college in a variety of fields, and to consign them only to a domestic role was perceived as oppressive and sexist. In the early 20th century, home economics was one of the only routes for an educated woman, but as the decades passed, more opportunities for women to achieve outside the home became available. Articles written on practice babies following this shift had a much more negative tone to them. The 1954 Time article on David North was one example, which quoted director of the Women's Services Division of the United Charities, Babette Penner, as saying, "Imagine what anxieties there are in a child who is given a bottle in 12 or more pairs of arms." Lisa Grunwald, author of a fiction novel which imagined the former practice baby's adult life, wrote in 2010 for the Huffington Post, "It took quite a while before anyone wondered what damage, perhaps less physical than psychological, might be inflicted by this system of being passed around like a cheese plate." In an article for ABC News in 2011, Executive Director of the Evan B. Donaldson Adoption Institute, Adam Pertman, spoke on the horrors of practice babies, declaring that nowadays child development experts know that permanence is what matters. Looking on the bright side, thank God we learned a lesson. Unintentionally, Pertman has gotten at the heart of the issue. The scientifically correct way to raise a child is different in 2022 than it was in 1922. Attitudes toward childcare have changed, which is precisely why practice homes for practice babies no longer exist. Pertman wondered how practice babies could have ever happened, saying, on its face, the fact that we could, as a society, as educated people, think this was a good idea is quite amazing. But in the 1920s, when practice babies were first introduced and growing in popularity, it was a good idea. The options for an unwanted child, or a child whose parents were unable to take care of them, were an orphanage or some other state facility. The modern infrastructure that aims to protect children and guide them to foster homes did not exist. Children often entered practice homes malnourished and ill, but left in remarkable health. Babies raised in a practice home were also highly sought after by potential families. Multiple mothers with high caliber training would not only maintain the child's development course but improve it. This belief is only made possible by an important change that occurred during this period, a shift from a privileging of heredity, common to the eugenics movement, to a belief that the environment of a child's upbringing mattered more, the latter championed by progressive social reformers such as Jane Addams. This made a difference for adoption policies as well as what it might mean for a child to be reared by scientific mothers. Based on their contemporary beliefs, practice babies were not only logical and normal, but desirable. Just as Pertman alluded to, modern understanding of infancy scores attachment theory, in which a permanent guardian gives a child a sense of security. When practice babies were implemented, their caregivers were also using the most modern scientific understanding at their disposal. Practice babies can be best understood when given the context out of which they arose, the application of scientific principles to motherhood in the Progressive era, which highly valued both science and the centrality of mothers to society. Modern glances at the topic, which label it as dystopian, belie a fundamental misunderstanding of the era. Like everything, practice babies were a product of their day. Once they were no longer valuable, the practice faded away and gave way to other methods of childcare. Before scorning the idea of family that practice babies lived through, it is worthwhile to remember that the nuclear family as defined in post-war North America, when the practice babies largely faded away, is not the only family, and certainly not the only good family that exists. Families with two parents of the same gender, with step-parents, with open adoptions, and with children who are raised by adults who are not their parents, are all homes with a great potential to have a loving and supportive environment for children to grow up in. Detractors came to prominence much later in the lifetime of practice baby programs, and once they were already fading. Early accounts of them offered no such criticism. Practice babies should not be and were not regarded as a perfect or right way to raise a child, but it is important to examine critiques of practice. The effect that this had on children who were practice babies is largely unknown, as they could not say how they felt and there was no large follow-up study on them as they grew. However, they do make sense when placed in their appropriate temporal and cultural context. Practice babies and the large support for them encourage examination of concepts of good and bad families. The unusual feature of this particular care arrangement is that it is the exact opposite of an orphanage, where one caretaker is responsible for several children. In the usual opposition to orphanages, a nuclear family, one or two caregivers tend to a smaller number of children. While intensive and solitary mothering currently rules the day, this is not always so, and at one time, more mothers were seen as inherently more valuable. Thank you.